Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center Middle East Program's first panel discussion of the new year titled The Middle East and North Africa in 2022, Regional Security and America's Role. My name is Marissa Khurma and I'm the director of the Middle East Program. While all eyes are currently glued to developments in the Ukraine, today's panel discussion will be zooming into the Middle East, yet another theater for great power competition and many challenges that the Biden administration faces in the region, from the Iranian nuclear file, the Iran's influence in the region, political developments in Lebanon and Iraq, the lingering conflicts in Syria and Yemen, as well as Libya. Each of these issues, of course, presents obstacles to the US goal of fostering security and stability in the region that unfortunately has been one of the most volatile regions in the world. Of course, our hope is that beyond analyzing these developments and the challenges that the Biden administration faces in the region, that this discussion will also touch on the opportunities for US engagement, not only to support its allies and partners in addressing these threats in their neighborhoods, but also to advance its national security interests. I'm very pleased to be introducing our distinguished panelists this morning, starting with Robin Wright, the USIP and Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow, who, by the way, just published an excellent piece on Russia in the New Yorker. Michael Singh, who is the Lane Swig Fellow at the Washington Institute and former Director of Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. Genevieve Abdo, Visiting Fellow, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, whose research and recent work has focused on political alliances and religious alliances amongst Shia communities in the Middle East. And last, but certainly not least, Abdullah Baboud, visiting professor at the Faculty of International Research and Education at Wasila University and chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies, who will bring us a very important perspective from the GCC, and he's currently joining us from Oman. And of course, I will turn this over to the moderator and chair of this panel discussion, Chair of the Middle East Program, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. Before I turn it over to you, Jim, though, just a reminder to all of you who are watching and listening to submit your questions to Twitter, and the handle is @WilsonCenterMEP, or by email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Marissa. First, a hearty welcome to our four guest panelists, and welcome to all of you who are tuning in this morning. It hasn't been a good week around the world for either the Biden administration or world peace, and it's the same in the Middle East. I've gotten into the habit of, whenever talking about any foreign policy subject, to start with the basics, because Washington, while it understands them intellectually, doesn't seem to deal with them as instinctive terms of reference anymore. The Biden administration, in its actions, in its relations with allies and challenges, and in the documents it's put out, such as the Interim National Security Strategy Guidance, is a full-throated supporter of the classic American-led international collective security order, perhaps the most vocal and conventional of the last four presidencies in some respects. And that's a good thing. But nonetheless, this effort to try to maintain this global order with challenges all around the world is running into trouble. Just look at what's happened in the last week. We have some signs with ever more Iranian enrichment to ever more dangerous degrees that there may be some interim agreement, but there's certainly turbulence in the American negotiating team, as a number of relatively senior members of the State Department team have just been either resigned or reassigned, as the State Department puts it. So there's some turbulence going on, and whatever comes out of this, it does not look like it will be a full blown return to the JCPOA that the Trump administration pulled out of in 2018, but we're certainly at a critical point. we're also at a critical point around the region. Just think what has happened. Extraordinary escalation of tension with Houthi attacks on continuing on Saudi Arabia, but then two strikes on the Emiratis, the second of which involved American combat action to intercept those missiles. Then in northeast Syria, which has been pretty quiet, we had a major outbreak of violence by ISIS, which we haven't heard all that much of recently, with a prison break and extensive combat involving American infantry in close combat out of Bradley armored vehicles for the first time since we've deployed those vehicles to northeast Syria, and some additional ISIS attacks in Iraq. Finally, on the Jordanian border, a major battle with smugglers, presumably smugglers one or another way linked to the Syrian government or elements thereof. 27 smugglers killed in a major battle where the Jordanian military authorities said they were backed by, quote, armed forces without any further identification. So the Middle East is seeing from a relatively high normal, if you will, in the last well, many years, is seeing an uptick in violence, while the rest of the world is seeing aggressiveness. As Marissa said, we're all focused on Ukraine, but there are other Russian actions. There's certainly the North Korean missile strikes and the long-term Chinese threats in the South China Sea, and particularly in Taiwan. So the question, first of all, is what's going on in the Middle East? What is America's specific policy? We know it's at the 50,000 foot level, it's a kind of pivot to Asia, focus on other things, but still by, with, and through our partners maintain one or another level of regional security. This administration has not ignored the Middle East. Look at its actions in the recent fighting between Hamas and Israel. But it does seem to not be clear in how it's going to deal with the challenges we're seeing, including Russian and Chinese intervention in the region, the actions of Iran in the region, as well as on the nuclear file, and frankly, the somewhat independent activities of many of our important partners, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, dealing with threats in the region. In the case of Turkey, also Ukraine. So now I'm going to turn it over, because I don't have the answers for this, to our spectacular panel. And I'll begin with you, Robin.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm honored to be speaking on this very distinguished panel with colleagues I admire profoundly for their expertise as well. So let me begin with Iran and say, in 2 weeks, it's amazing, Iran will celebrate the anniversary of its revolution. It's 43 years, and there's no sign it's going anyplace, whatever the wishes of the outside world or its the opposition forces inside the country. I've been covering Iran now since 1973, so I'm actually older than the revolution. The question posed is, what are the challenges from Iran in 2022? And I think you can break it up into 3 different categories. The main focus, as Jim acknowledged, is the issue of whether we can get Iran and the United States back into the nuclear deal, which was the most significant non-proliferation treaty in more than a quarter century. The deal is important on a lot of different levels, and they extend well beyond Iran. So first, the first point is that the world's nuclear order is already perilous. It's now at risk of actually unraveling, because many of the deals that were worked out in the 20th century are fraying or eroding or have been abandoned altogether. And the danger is, as the United States and Russia and China are all modernizing their arsenals, that the nuclear weapon again becomes, gains a lot of attention and, thought about, would it ever actually be used in war? The Pentagon now estimates that China will have 1,000 nuclear weapons in just 8 years. So the original deal was designed to prevent a 10th nation from getting the bomb. and the last one was North Korea in 2006. The bottom line is that reviving the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is one of the most unwieldy titles ever created for any agreement, was Biden's first major foray into kind of the major flashpoints in the world. And the collapse of the talks in Vienna would have major consequences worldwide in terms of just the mentality, the momentum, the idea of nuclear weapons, which have kind of been on the back burner in terms of being a real threat for a long time. The second reason that this is so important in looking at this year, next year, and down the road is that the talks are intended to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons across the Middle East, which is the world's most volatile region, anytime soon. There's already obvious interest by several countries in getting the bomb. Israel's had it since the 1960s. Saddam Hussein in Iraq tried to develop a program. Israel took care of that in an attack in 1981. Syria was building a nuclear facility for military purposes, as the US intelligence community concluded, with help from North Korea. And again, Israel attacked it in an early stage in 2007. But if Iran should actually get closer to a bomb, then Saudi Arabia has pledged it will look for a nuclear weapon as well. So the second bottom line is the last thing the Middle East needs is both Shiite powers and Sunni powers, or the centers of Shiite and Sunni thinking and governance, is to get a nuclear weapon. So where do we stand on the talks? We are really down to the wire. 2 weeks ago, Secretary of State Blinken said that there was only a few weeks left until Tehran's advances will become too difficult to reverse. The Russian envoy, who's fascinating to follow on Twitter because he's ever optimistic and sometimes quite funny, has even acknowledged that they were not likely to get a deal until the end of February. And that really is, I think, well beyond what the US wants. The timing is important because the US now estimates that the breakout time, which is the time required to produce enough fuel to fuel a bomb, is as little as 3 weeks. Now, that doesn't actually mean Iran could then build a nuclear weapon in 3 weeks, because there are other steps required. It will have to weaponize the enriched uranium. It has to marry it to a warhead, and then it has to integrate it with a delivery system, such as a missile. But Iran's advances exceed anything that had been anticipated. We've really crossed a threshold, and some of this is in response to President Trump's maximum pressure. Iranian revolutionary paranoia set in. Iran accelerated its program, both its nuclear program and its missile program, and it has made significant progress. Now, we all know that or we believe anyway, that the supreme leader, the politicos in Iran, have not made what is a political decision to actually get the bomb. But if it should cross that threshold, Iran is now dangerously close to being able to actually get there. The supreme leader says it won't happen under his watch, but he won't be there forever. He turns 83 this July. So I want to add to Jim's note also about worrying about the US team in Vienna. It is of deep concern that two of the really fine experts, Richard Nephew, who is the expert on sanctions, very deeply involved in crafting the original 2015 nuclear deal, and Ariane Tabatabai, who is an expert at the RAND Corporation and previously a fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, have both opted to leave the team. And I think that's not a good sign. So we have lots of layers of disagreements playing out in Vienna. The bottom line is that the Iranians, who have invented chess and who are masters at brinksmanship, time is running out, really running out. And we could maybe pull off a miracle at the end of the day, but I think The new regime in Tehran is feeling quite heady. And, you know, there's no guarantee at all that they will go back as they promised. And even if we should get back to the 2015 deal, the danger is that Iran also has another front that is very worrisome, and that's Iran's missile program, which over the past 5 years has, again, exceeded all expectations by Iran now has a missile that can hit 2,000 kilometers away, deep into China to the east, Russia to the north, as far south as Ethiopia and Somalia, and as far west as Greece. There's no country in the world that has a 2,000 kilometer missile that doesn't have a nuclear weapon. So let me turn to the second flashpoint, which is Iran's interventions in the wider Middle East. Iran's network of allies and proxies is arguably broader and better than at any time since the Revolutionary Guards fostered the creation of Hezbollah in 1982. Iran is not just identified partners to align with, which is the usual route to creating an alliance. It's actually gone out into the region and created allies, which is in many ways kind of unprecedented. And in turn, some of those groups like Hezbollah have their own little franchises, little subgroups that it operates, some small in neighborhoods, some operating just in cities. But we've got a huge coalition with subgroups now across the Middle East. Effectively, if you want to kind of compare what Iran has done, it's kind of its own version of a NATO alliance, in that there's a military agreement where each has pledged to go out and defend the others if they come under threat. And remember, the problem with some of these proxies is that Iran over the last few years has also accelerated the deployment of rockets and missiles and what they call these precision kits, where engineers can transform these imprecise rockets into longer range, very precise missiles. And that's one of the most dangerous things. Iran has used the old smuggling routes in the Middle East, the flow of the Dows through the Gulf, to transfer parts and whole missiles to its proxies. So we're, and over the last few years, we've seen Iran becoming more belligerent, more bellicose, more confident, more daring in its regional activities. We saw that with the strike on US forces in Iraq 2 years ago after the US assassinated General Soleimani, the Iranian general who orchestrated Iran's foreign operations. It was the attack on al-Assad base where US forces were stationed in Iraq was the largest missile attack ever by American forces anywhere in the world since 1953, since the Korean War. We've seen it play out recently this month with the attacks by the Houthis on the United Arab Emirates, in which the United States actually got involved in using Patriot missiles to shoot them down. Now, Iran is far from omnipotent. We sometimes kind of grant them too much in the way of what their powers are. Since the US assassinated General Soleimani, the mastermind, Iran has had a harder time both controlling and orchestrating its network of proxies. And all of these proxies have their own agenda, and sometimes they don't always match what the Iranians want them to do or want them not to do. And there is, for example, some US questioning of whether Iran had anything to do or knew about the attack in November, the attempted assassination attack on Iraq's prime minister, and whether Iran orchestrated or ordered its local proxies to carry that out. So I guess the bottom line is that Iran does have the most powerful network across the world's most volatile region, but Iran's powers are not total. And that really complicates dealing both with Iran and its allies and limiting their ability to create nefarious activities. And I've gone on for too long, but I'll just say on the third point, which is our American concern about human rights, the fate of the, the kind of dictatorial policies of the regime. I encourage everyone to read Crane Britton's The Anatomy of Revolution, because he so brilliantly lays out the 4 phases of the revolution. We've all waited for that 4th phase in which there's some kind of return to normalcy, or the beginnings of a revolution becoming a normal state. There were times when we thought during President Khatami in the late 1990s, even President Rafsanjani in the late 80s and early 90s, and then again under President Rouhani, who left office last year, that there might be a period where Iran would return to the community of nations, or try to anyway. It instead consolidated the rule of the hardliners last year, who now control all 3 branches of government: the parliament, the judiciary, and the executive branch. The Revolutionary Guards have penetrated government. They are ever deeper in terms of the roles they play in other branches, well beyond the military. And this comes at a time when the vast majority of the population has been born since the revolution. The vast majority of the voters have been born since the revolution, and their questioning of their engagement or their support of the revolution was reflected last year, when the majority of Iranians didn't bother to vote at a very important election. So at this anniversary, Iran is more dangerous. It has more influence in the region, even though it is uneven and sometimes unpredictable. But there is not enough internal opposition to create an alternative. And in one funny note, Iran had to acknowledge today that the MEK, the exile opposition group, managed to hack into Iranian television today and broadcast for several seconds the picture of Rajavi, the woman who heads, and her now missing husband, who founded the MEK, as well as they flashed on Iranian television death to Khamenei. So people are still trying, but so far without much impact. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jim. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Robin. Geneva Abdo, over to you, please. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thanks to the Wilson Center. Thanks to you, Ambassador Jeffrey, and to Marissa for the invitation. I'm going to focus on 2 civil society movements, which I think have made a great impact in the Middle East over the last 2 or 3 years, and also, as you mentioned, Ambassador, offer an opportunity for the United States, which is something that may not seem so obvious for those policy makers and watchers in Washington. These 2 movements involve Lebanon and Iraq. And there are many aspects of these movements which have geopolitical consequences for the Middle East. Namely, they're both countries where Iran, as Robin mentioned, has had a strong influence, if not for years, in the case of Lebanon, for decades. So I think it's important for us, the Washington establishment tends to focus on state power. And I've always been someone who has tried to emphasize the societal power that we sort of tend to minimize, because as we've seen in both of these countries, I would say that Iraq is more the success story, Lebanon is not. But as I will provide in some detail the sort of evolution of the movement in Iraq, we are seeing that in fact, the civil society movement in Iraq is changing the political dynamics and the political landscape that is very important for US policy and for the future of Iraq, a country that, of course, the United States has been engaged since 2003. So let me just start with some of the similarities and differences between these 2 movements. You have 2 countries where a sectarian power sharing system has been in play for many years. In Iraq, of course, it has happened since 2003, since the invasion, where the United States was instrumental in creating a power structure that was basically Shia dominated. In Lebanon, of course, as Robin mentioned, we have the creation of Hezbollah in the early 1980s that has been, an Iranian proxy, but has been more than that. It's a social movement, it's a political movement, and it's been very instrumental in Lebanese politics, and even more so in recent years. So you have two countries where the ethnic makeup of the populations has created a sectarian power sharing system as a way to try to create some sort of equilibrium among all these different sects and different religious identities. I would say that what has happened basically is that in the Iraqi case, a younger generation, we always talk about the importance of demographics in the United States as sort of a theoretical notion that, the Middle East is going to change one day because a younger generation will somehow unseat sitting autocrats. We saw that in Egypt, an attempt in Egypt. We've seen it in other places during the Arab uprisings. But we saw in these cases that, in fact, the autocrats became clever and became more skilled at sort of repressing civil society movements. And again, I think that the reason to sort of look at Lebanon and Iraq, the civil society movements there, is that we're in a new phase of the development of civil society mobilization. So in the case of, Iraq, I think that the demographics have mattered. And we've seen a younger generation of Iraqis who not only were in the movement that began in 2019, and the Lebanese protest movement began literally only a few days apart from the recent Lebanese movement from the Iraqi civil society movement in October 2019. In the case of Iraq, we saw a younger generation that was saying no to sectarian power sharing system, no to corruption, no to lack of basic services such as electricity, and really demanding transparency from the government and an electoral system that I guess correctly or more democratically reflects the population. So in Iraq, you had a system, and you still do, but it's been somewhat watered down, whereby the elections really are sort of an exercise at the ballot box by the population, but the formation of the government happens in back rooms many months after the election is held. So for example, the choice of prime minister, which is still underway now in Iraq, even though the election happened in October, has not been determined yet. It will be determined by the faction that won the most seats in the parliamentary elections in October. So the protest movement was an attempt, much like in Lebanon, to demand a much fairer electoral process. So these are similar demands that the Lebanese civil society movement articulated also in 2019, an end to corruption, an end to sectarian power sharing system. But what has happened is that these two civil society movements took very, very different courses. In the case of Iraq, as I mentioned, I think it's a success story. Some of the parties that emerged, political parties were formed from the protest movement. They ran candidates in the election in October. They won seats. And more importantly than that, independents that are either sympathizing with the protest movement or actually are independent sort of in name only, but also participated or were activists in the protest movement. They won a great number of seats, fairly significant number of seats in the parliament. And so we have seen the street movement now enter the political sphere. And this is very important because these young people who were on the streets of Iraq figured out that there were two trends of thought. One was to boycott the elections, and that happened. A great number of activists and protesters were campaigning on a boycott. They boycotted the election. But then there was another school of thought who said, if we want to reform the system, we have to participate in it. And again, they won seats. And the result of this protest movement has been very significant, not only in terms of the future government formation of Iraq, which we will see unfold in the next few months or so, but also in terms of Iran's influence. And this gets back to what Robin mentioned. So both of these movements, and I'll get to Lebanon in a moment, but both of these movements to some degree were, part of their grievance was in opposition to Iran's influence in their countries. And I guess we tend to sort of accept as a fait accompli that Iran has these proxies and there's nothing anybody can do about it. We tend to view the proxies in terms of Iran pulling the strings. But I would argue that, in fact, in the case of these two Iranian presence in Lebanon, Hezbollah, of course, and the Iraqi Shia militias that are Iranian backed, that they both are political players inside their respective countries. So while they may accept funding, of course, from Iran, resources from Iran, in fact, in the case of Iraq, the Shia militias actually receive, they're budgeted in the Iraqi budget every year. So they receive resources from the Iraqi government. Nonetheless, we should not consider them, and I would make this argument of all of Iran's proxies, as simple puppets of the regime in Tehran, because their primary objectives are their political power inside their respective countries. So what happened in the case of Iraq, as opposed to Lebanon, is that the protest movement was very much an anti-Iran movement. They burned the consulate, Iranian consulate in Najaf, for example. They expressed in very clear terms that they no longer supported the idea that the Shia militias, which are not just militias, they run political parties, they're inside the parliament, should have a role in the government. And this has made a great dent, I would say, in Iranian influence in Iraq. And the evidence of that is that the Iranian parties, the Iranian-backed parties, the Shia militias, did very poorly in the election. So this protest movement not only was able to elect their own candidates to the parliament, but they were able to defeat long-term Shia political parties that are affiliated with the militias that have been in power really in Iraq since 2003. So I think that this is a very important development. It offers an opportunity for the United States, not only in terms of the decline, I would say, certainly not the demise, but the decline of Iran's influence in Iraq, but it's an opening to engage Shia societies. And I'll talk about sort of the regional Shia dynamics in a moment. So I think that Iraq is a success story we should pay attention to. I think we're going to see a lot of interesting and new developments because of the work the civil society movement was engaged in over 2 years. Even though they were intimidated, they were kidnapped by the Shia militias and some of the Iraqi security forces. They combated all of that and actually, I think, really changed in a fundamental way the political dynamics in Iraq. Lebanon, unfortunately, is much less of a success story. The civil society movement there was pushed back, defeated. I mean, we're seeing, I think, Hezbollah emerge certainly in a much better position than they were 2 years ago, especially with the departure of Saad Hariri from the political scene, which we just saw in the last few days. So there's a huge Sunni vacuum in Lebanon that I think is being filled by some of the more corrupt and sectarian parties such as Hezbollah. So Lebanon is a much, I would say, certainly not the success story that we've seen in Iraq. And I think in sort of in contrast to Iraq, we're also seeing, for example, Hezbollah drawing Iran more into the Lebanese scene. For example, as we all have read, Lebanon has a very severe electricity problem. There is electricity for most Lebanese only a few hours, if that much, per day. So Hezbollah got free electricity from Iran. So this is the way I think that Hezbollah, with the vacuum, the Sunni vacuum, and also the vacuum of other competing parties and movements, has tried to draw Iran further into Lebanon. So that's sort of, I would say, the success, not the success story of Iraq. Now, I think that the opening that I see for the United States, and I actually conducted a workshop in December of Middle East scholars who work on Shia communities and Shia politics. And I think that there was a consensus among all these Arab scholars that the shifts in Shia politics that are happening in the region, you have Shia societies who are increasingly opposed to Iran. You have Shia societies who have looked much more towards Ayatollah Sistani rather than Ayatollah Khamenei, Marja Taqlid. So you're seeing on a political level, on a religious level, a shift in Shia alliances, and on a theological level as well, which sometimes is unnoticed. And this is happening not only in Iraq, not only in Lebanon, where there is opposition to Hezbollah that we have not seen before, but it's happening also in a country such as Bahrain, where even though the opposition movement and the mainstream opposition movement, al-Wafaq, has been marginalized politically and basically has been forced to disappear from the political scene, there's a very active opposition movement outside. And I think that what we are seeing is much more of a coordination among Arab Shia communities in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Lebanon, and to some degree in Saudi Arabia that we have not seen in the past. So what happens in Iraq among the Shia does not stay in Iraq. And I think that this is a very important development. And as the scholars in this workshop that I convene noted, this is an important policy opportunity, not only for the United States, but for the West, to engage the Shia in a way that has not really happened before. Because when we have often thought about civil society movements in the Middle East, we always associate them with Sunni movements. There has always been somewhat of a false assumption that the Shia are loyalists of Iran, and that's no longer the case. Well, I should say it's increasingly no longer the case. So this is what I see to be an important and far less obvious opportunity for new policy attention, new policy engagement with communities in the Middle East, and is very much a departure from our tradition of either engaging states only or looking to civil society movements as being strictly Sunni. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike, that's a lot to unwrap. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today and to be with my fellow panelists. I'm going to talk about a completely different set of factors than the sort of fascinating things which both Robin and Genevieve mentioned. We prefaced this discussion by talking about the U.S. desire, which is now a long-running desire, to focus less on the Middle East. And so many of these problems that we're talking about are frankly problems that I think the sort of policymakers in the Biden administration don't really want to tackle. I think what you're seeing from the Biden administration on the Middle East is a sort of a deliberate lack of big initiatives, a deliberate lack of significant sort of policymaking investment in this region, not because they think it's unimportant, not because they think we don't have interests there, but more because they simply want to prioritize other issues. China obviously is number one, and obviously Russia and Ukraine has quickly climbed that list in recent weeks and months. And we can argue whether that's right, whether that it'll be successful and so forth, but it is a long-running trend in American policy, which I think the Biden administration is trying to commit to. And where you see them investing effort, it's on those issues like Iran's nuclear program, where there's a clear sort of direct threat to the United States. If Iran got nuclear weapons, that would clearly be something that would threaten the United States in a sort of new and alarming way. I won't go into that issue too deeply, except to say I think one thing we can't ignore is that whatever may be happening in Vienna, whatever may come out of Vienna, I think it's increasingly the case that Iran's neighbors in the Gulf, Israel, and so forth, have reconciled themselves, or maybe resigned themselves is a better term, to Iran as at least a sort of nuclear threshold state. I think that there is not a lot of confidence that whatever the United States does is going to somehow roll back Iran in a very significant way. And that will have implications for the region. It will have implications, for example, for proliferation, as Robin mentioned. And the United States, I think, in a world where you do have states like North Korea and Iran either crossing the nuclear threshold or coming up to it, in a world where the United States is seen as less reliable, will increasingly face proliferation challenges from allies and partners, not just from adversaries, both in this region and in other regions. One of the problems that Jim didn't mention at the outset in the world is that we've seen a very large number of North Korean missile launches in recent days. And so, things are going haywire everywhere, essentially. Another thing which, though, the United States, I think, will have to focus on in the Middle East, whether we want to or not, is, in the context of great power competition with Russia and China, I think it's easy to see the Middle East as a distraction from that focus. But I think that increasingly, in fact, the Middle East, as well as other regions of the world, are to some extent a theater or an arena for great power competition. China has moved much more significantly into the Middle East, especially economically, but not only economically. Just recently in the Wall Street Journal, everyone will have seen this story about Chinese military construction, alleged military construction in the United Arab Emirates, a country which is one of the United States' closest security partners in the region. And so facing a China and also obviously Russia, which are more interested in being involved in the Middle East and projecting power there, facing partners who don't want to choose between the US and China, China often being their largest trading partner, even for states like Israel, which are quite close to the United States. The United States will need to invest some time and some policymaking resources in the question of how do you counter China and Russia in a region like the Middle East without sort of being drawn into, once again, trying to do everything in the Middle East. And I think that will be a big challenge. The third point I want to mention, and then I'm going to stop, is the Abraham Accords, because I've mentioned two concerning things, but this is something which is maybe something which is encouraging, frankly. It's an opportunity for the United States, because one thing the United States has always wanted, or I should say two things the United States have always wanted, is number one, to be able to address some of the deeper problems in the region. We tend to focus very much on the sort of short-term conflicts, whatever's on fire right now, whether that's Syria, whether that's a Gaza conflict, whether it's whatever Iran is doing, without really having an answer or having maybe even the bandwidth to address the deeper issues in the region. Unemployment, the lack of a thriving private sector, the lack of economic integration in the Middle East, the lack of political forums in the region to address problems. I wouldn't suggest that the Abraham Accords solves those problems, but it is a step towards those problems. If you can have integration between Israel and the Gulf states, Israel and the UAE even, that maybe is a step towards a broader regional integration, bearing in mind that, in Europe, about 66% of economic activity is internal to Europe. In the Middle East, it's somewhere between 9 and 13%, the lowest in the world of any region. And so taking a step towards solving that maybe is a step towards addressing some of the deeper problems that fuel the conflicts in the region. It also potentially is a way to ensure that US partners will be more resilient towards China. Not to say that the Abraham Accords, again, is some kind of anti-China alliance, far from it. In a way, it's an opportunity for China to some extent as well. But I think we would agree that our partners standing together to some extent, even if it's only modestly at first, will be more sort of able to stand up to Chinese, for example, use of economics as political leverage than they would individually. And hopefully they'll do better at it than, say, the Europeans are with respect to Lithuania right now, or Western states in general did with respect to Australia recently. And then third, there is, of course, that possibility that the Abraham Accords eventually turns into a way for our partners to cooperate on security matters without the direct intervention of the United States. And again, we're far from that now. But it's noteworthy that after there was this Houthi missile attack and drone attack on the UAE, the Israeli prime minister came out very quickly and offered assistance. And I think we're in a world now where it's not inconceivable that the Emiratis or other Arab states could accept that assistance, could accept it not necessarily secretly, but even more openly. And that leads to a type of security coordination in the region that we haven't seen in the past. So I'll stop there. Three big topics which can certainly be explored further. But anyway, that's my contribution, Jim.
Thank you very much, Mike. Appreciate that. Abdullah, it's over to you to wrap everything up from everybody, and then we'll move on to questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's always a pleasure to be invited with such a distinguished panel. And it's always easier when you're the last speaker because you do benefit from all the other points. But let me just start by saying, bringing some new ideas as well, if you don't mind. And that is, how does the Gulf states look into their security and to the US involvement in the region? Well, as you know, the Gulf states created their regional organization, the Gulf Cooperation Council, because of what they saw as a security threat to the region. Because of then the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Iran-Iraq War, the events in Mecca, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet getting closer to the oil-rich region through Horn of Africa and South Yemen, etc. And the whole idea was to create a regional organization that can help them to secure their borders and defend themselves against any potential threat. Now, 40 years down the line, that hasn't gone much down that route, as it were. As we've heard from colleagues, our cities are now being attacked. And, this is like unheard of in our recent history in the Gulf. So what has changed in one sense? And why is it that the Gulf security is not as secure as it was? And what is the American role, US role in this region? Well, let me start by saying that, the traditional way of looking at security in the region is, the classical way is to look at hard security challenges, soft security challenges, or internal versus external. And maybe it's time that we need to look beyond that. And because I think that kind of limits the way we look at things. And I would offer that we need to look at the nature of the Arab state itself. And is this Arab state inclusive enough to bring in everybody and all the factions into cooperating and living in a state that they feel that they belong to? Or is it going to keep continuing this kind of ethnic sectarian division? Unfortunately, this has happened in Iraq and in Yemen, Lebanon, everywhere else in the region, even within the Gulf states. I think we also have to look at the nature of leadership. We all talk about authoritarian stability, and of course, it does play a role to a certain extent. But is it as stable as it is, as people really believe it is? I think authoritarianism sometimes can lead to instability in the region. And, the very personal way of decision-making in some of the Gulf states has led to instability because there is no accountability at the end of the day. And there are no institutions that can balance the power of decision-making within the Gulf. And I think the Gulf states, being rich, oil-rich countries, and living on the income of oil, they cannot live in a region where the whole region is in turmoil. Sooner or later, this is going to bounce back on them, especially as they start to get involved in these conflicts themselves and try to support one group against the other. And basically, what we're living now, we are witnessing that. So that is like some of the key issues. And the other one is relating to what the previous speakers have mentioned, is of course there is challenge, and maybe with different threat perceptions from Iran, and different countries in the region look at Iran differently. Some see it as a challenge, some see it as a more serious challenge, and some see it as a threat. And Iran has benefited from all the mistakes that the US administration has made in the region, and also all the mistakes that our Gulf states have made in the region, and took advantage of it. So, we talk about Iran controlling 4 Arab capitals. Maybe that's true, but who allowed that to happen, and how did it happen? Is that something we need to ask ourselves? Why did this happen in the first place that allows Iran to interfere in Arab states and Arab countries? And I think also looking at Iran in one way is, we still look at Iran as if it's the revolutionary country that was started to export its revolution. I think Iran has changed a lot, and we need to have a new way of looking at Iran and maybe engaging with it rather than trying to put it under maximum pressure, which we've seen what has this led to. We try to close the roads for Iran. We try not to engage with them, but they found ways of engaging with us through conflicts and wars, and through supporting their proxies in the region. So I think that is one thing that we need to think about. The other thing we need to think about is this historical rivalry, hegemonic rivalry of one country, one big countries like Iran or Saudi Arabia trying to control the region. And I think time has come that they have to understand that no one can control the region. You can have an influence, but other countries are going to gang against you. It's an old game, as it were, and it will not. No one will be allowed to be the hegemonic power. And the sooner that some of the leaders in the region recognize that, the better. The other challenge, if I may say, is the US policy towards the region. Not only, having signed a nuclear deal with Iran, which with all its, shortfalls, etc., was, helpful in some ways, but then, we abandoned it, or the US abandoned it, and went into maximum pressure, angering the Iranians and also making them even much more stubborn in their policies, calling for the removal of all the international powers from the region, and trying to create problems for them in the region, and problems for us as well. Besides US policies in the region, the whole idea of what is the US doing in the region? Is it really protecting the states in the region? When Saudi Arabia was attacked, the US did not do much. And there are signs that, as we've heard from my previous colleague speaking, there are signs that the US is abandoning the region. Now, whether we believe in that or not is another matter, but perception is important, and perception is a reality. So there is a perception in the region that the US is abandoning the region. That is one. And two, even if it's not abandoning the region and will keep some interest in the region, it's not here. The US is not here to defend us. So, they are now struggling to find ways of doing that. And you'll not be surprised if, some countries are working with China to develop a more strategic relationship, or working with Russia or other powers. So a combination of, abandonment and encirclement is driving these countries crazy into extent that they don't know what to do, what to read of their strategic partner, what to do, what to read of even themselves, their neighbors as well, and their partners and their allies within the GCC. As you know, the Gulf crisis, and there was even a talk about perhaps some of the Gulf states were going to invade another Gulf states. At least it was muted. So who do they trust in this region? Who is your partner? If your ally within the GCC is not your partner, and you're suspicious of them, and your international ally is not a partner and is not going to be here to defend you, you can understand how people in the region are feeling. And then now that there are countries in the region working towards, in the next 20 to 30 years, not to be dependent on the United States. But who will they depend on? Obviously not their own power or their own Arab states, because they don't have the power to be able to confront Iran or anybody else. So obviously they're going to bring in other international powers like, Russia, which is already finding leeways in the region, and China to a certain extent, and play them off. And that regional, not only regional competition, but international competition in the region also brings insecurity to the region. And the other thing I wanted to add is what Mike had mentioned, and that is about the Abraham Accord. As much as one wants to applaud any move towards reconciliation, negotiations, dialogue, accepting all the countries in the region on equal footing, etc., one could look at the Abraham Accord as a positive step, and I can understand that. But maybe it could be looked at as another, as a negative step, in a sense that it hasn't really helped anywhere in resolving the main conflict. The main conflict is not between United Arab Emirates or the rest of the Gulf states and Israel. The main conflict is the Arab-Israeli or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that has not been resolved, and there is no movement towards that. The Arab peace plan is there, and no one wants to. Israel doesn't want to talk about it. Israel doesn't want to give the Palestinians their own state, and it doesn't want to include them in one-state solution. It wants its own cake and eat it. And therefore, while two countries in the region have signed, or at least in the Gulf, signed the Abraham Accord for their own reasons, and maybe mainly because of competition with Iran and the fear of Iran and other neighbors, it's not necessarily going to help towards peace. In fact, if anything, it's going to bring in Israel in confrontation further with Iran, and polarize the region even more. And I think what is needed is a new way of thinking, and thinking that that's not just inside the box or outside the box. Thinking without a box, a new paradigm shift in the region, that the whole region, regional powers, the regional countries can work together towards peace, prosperity, human rights, and accepting each other on equal footing, and trying to find ways to collaborate and defend themselves. Without that, the whole region will still be open for international manipulation, regional powers competition, internal struggles, and the challenges are huge. Mike mentioned, the economic challenges, the environmental challenges that we are now seeing. The way that wars have been conducted, proxies, unconventional wars, etc. The use of drones, the missiles, the proliferation, whether it is mass weapons of mass destruction, whether it's nuclear or not. All of this is happening, on our watch and on our clock, and it is actually dangerous as we see it in the region. And at the moment, there isn't that kind of either US or European, who've been also traditionally supporting the security in the region. there doesn't seem to be any convergence of interest or even a view. We have created a number of regional security arrangements, whether it is the Arab or the Islamic or the European the European maritime security, a number of competing security arrangements in the Gulf. That is not adding to security. If anything, it's adding to more insecurity and instability and confusion in the region. And I'm sorry to be the bearer of the bad news, but I think it is really a time that we should look into the whole security of the Gulf in a very different way. And I think the United States has a very important role to play, being, of course, still the global power. And I think the United States need to be clear of who are their partners, what does it really want in terms of security, and you know, and to create something that is much more inclusive and more comprehensive in the way that we can start to sort out some of the remaining political issues. We cannot demolish everything, and we cannot get rid of all the different problems, you know, whether ethnic or sectarian or religious or etc. But there are ways that other countries, other regions in the world have done it. And I'm sure we can learn from those, whether it is in Asia, whether it's in South America, whether it is Central Asia. There are so many ways that the lessons that we could learn. It seems that we are just experimenting here, and at the cost of the lives and the wealth and the well-being and the security of the people and the countries in the region, and also the global security at large. And I will stop here if I may.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. We're now in the question and answer period. We invite all of you to submit questions to the panel by emailing MEP@Wilson Center, one word, at wilsoncenter.org, or via Twitter. That's the handle is @WilsonCenterMEP, one word, Wilson Center MEP, WC and MEP all capitalized. But let me ask the first question. I'll turn back to you, Abdullah. Your analysis of the underlying instabilities and diplomatic and security problems of the Gulf region and beyond throughout the Middle East is absolutely on target. But as I know Mike Singh will confirm, the US government focuses almost always on the immediate and the superficial. So I'm going to ask you an immediate and superficial Gulf question, if I may. And that is, Qatar's foreign minister is in Iran today, and the Emir of Qatar will be meeting with Joe Biden next week. Can Qatar play a role in diplomatic efforts with Iran? It has good relations with seemingly everybody in the region, including from Israel to Iran, and most recently, seemingly better with Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis. And for everybody, please keep your responses to 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you, Abdullah, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I think Qatar, all the smaller countries in the region, Qatar and Oman in particular, but also Kuwait, have been trying to play this role for a very long time. As small countries, they want to live in peace, of course, and they can see that they are kind of sandwiched between two regional giants. And they don't want to see any kind of conflict happening in the region. Qatar, in particular, shares oil field with gas field with Iran, and any conflict with Iran is going to affect Qatar in a very dramatic way. Oman has the same thing, sharing the water of Strait of Hormuz with Iran, and it doesn't want to see any conflict with Iran. And I think Oman and Qatar and also Kuwait can play a very important role in this regard. And Qatar has been playing this quite well. They've learned from their own problems, of course, and the blockade that happened, and they have developed a very sophisticated diplomacy, and they have good relationship now with the United States. And as you mentioned, Ambassador, the Emir is coming to help Europe in exporting gas to Europe should any problem happen in Ukraine. and the foreign minister obviously going to Iran to see if there are ways that we can nudge Iran towards more peaceful resolution of this nuclear issue. I believe that Iran wants a deal. And I think the United States also wants a deal as well. And I think the global community wants a deal. There are only a few countries in the Gulf that they don't want a deal, and maybe Israel to a certain extent, or at least some factions within Israel. And I think it's just not a matter of what a deal. I believe it will be coming, but maybe there always one cannot predict how things to happen. But I think there's going to be a deal at least, but it's not necessarily a deal that is going to be like the previous one. It could be an interim, but at least it could be the first step towards more confidence building with Iran. What we need is to see Iran living comfortably within its own borders, and also feeling secure, because the Iranians feel insecure with all these powers around them. And the reason that they want to develop these missiles and they want to develop these nuclear facilities, etc., is to project power and to secure themselves. The regime feels threatened. So I think the more that they feel that they are being accepted to the international community, the better for all of us, for the global community, for us in the region. And what we want to see is more collaboration between us and Iran, between us and Iraq, between us and Turkey, between us and Israel, obviously, when things are right in that regard. The region needs to think differently, and we need to accept Iran as well as others into the region. The region is not just made of Arab countries, and this is something that we need to also consider. There are others who live in the region, and we need to take into consideration their interests as well, and their security threat and security perception or threat perception, so that we can live together. So I think there could be something there, and I think Qatar has proved to be very tactful in terms of conducting diplomacy and negotiations and so on. And I hope there will be something to push forward the Iranian government and also the US government to come to some kind of a solution to the nuclear issue. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Question to Michael. And once again, everybody, please keep the answers to 2 to 3 minutes. Will the U.S. inevitably coexist as a great power with Russia and China as a military supplier and economic partner? Will this increased presence create security tensions? Must a dominant power prevail in the region? I think that means, is it inherent that a dominant power, that the region tends to have a dominant power? So over to you, Mike, for the big strategic.
Well, I mean, I would say we're already coexisting with the Russians and Chinese in the ways that the question asked. Obviously, China is, for the most part, the premier economic partner for I would say most countries in the Middle East. And for the most part, I don't think the United States considers that in and of itself a problem. It can become a problem, especially when states become overly dependent on China in a way which gives China diplomatic or political leverage over them. And we've seen this play out in other cases, mostly in East Asia, but not only in East Asia. So if you look at Oman, for example, Oman sends 80% of its oil exports to China, and oil exports are its main source of government revenue. That's potentially a vulnerability. Egypt borrowed, I think, $5 billion from China last year, in large part to fuel this construction spree that President Sisi has been on. That's a potential vulnerability as well, whereas most other countries in the region aren't really susceptible too much to the sort of debt traps that we've seen China use elsewhere. Russia is the region's #2 military supplier after the United States, and has been for a long time. So these are not necessarily new dynamics. I think the major new dynamic would be threefold. Number one, the United States itself stepping back from the region, which helps to create space for others to fill, whether that's external powers or regional powers like Iran. Number two, we've certainly seen Russia be more aggressive, not just in its near abroad, but within the Middle East itself, and try to use what are frankly limited means to achieve maximal policy gains, oftentimes with a specific purpose, it seems, of frustrating the United States. But most concerning, I would say, is China, because you see that massive economic investment and commitment to the region almost inevitably implicates China diplomatically and militarily in the region. And we've seen this mounting over the past decade or so, and there's no reason to think that trend won't continue. I don't know that it's inevitable that, you have one dominant external power in the region. That certainly hasn't been the case historically, but it's certainly, I think, the United States' aim that our partners should continue to have a close relationship with us, and frankly, limit the types of cooperation they engage in with other external powers, especially on the military, security, and intelligence side of the house, because as soon as they start engaging in that type of cooperation, obviously that becomes problematic for the United States. But that's not to say, again, that all of the types of cooperation those partners engage in with Russians and Chinese is seen as threatening in Washington. That's not the case. I think what we need to do, and I'll end here, is to try to be very specific and precise with our partners about what type of cooperation with Moscow and Beijing is problematic for Washington, and then work hopefully to preempt that rather than simply reacting to it after we learn about it. That, I think, is important for healthy partnerships in the region.
Great point. Whether we can sell the argument that buying gas from Russia is among those issues is something that right now today we'll see. Okay, another question, and it is, what is the status and future of Iran's strength and drone capability? What I would like is, Robin, for you to tackle this, but then Genevieve, based on building on what you told us earlier, whether how you see capabilities such as drones in the hands of Iran's, as you pointed out, somewhat independent acting proxies and partners might play out in the months and years ahead. So first, you, Robin, please. You're on mute, Robin.
Iran has proven in recent years its ability not only to use drones, but to build its own ones and to replicate even ones that it has it captured. I believe one went down from Afghanistan or over Afghanistan into Iranian territory, and it cloned it. Iranians love to kind of brag about their capabilities. They put some of their stuff on display. And I think that's what our own Central Command is deeply concerned about. It's Iran's missile capabilities and its drones, and the fact that it's using them, that it's helping its allies in the region develop their own drone capabilities. I think it's something that we don't pay enough attention to. The one danger, and it borders a little bit on what you've asked Jenny to talk about, and that is how independent are Iran's allies, partners, whatever in the region when it comes to fulfilling their own agendas. And I know, for example, that Hezbollah was ordered to do something last year, or instructed or encouraged, whatever, to do something by Iran, and Nasrallah, the Secretary General, refused to do it. And that reflects Iran. The local allies are not totally under the thumb of Iran. They have their own interests. And but at the end of the day, if they come under attack or feel threatened, they will use what they have. And the technological edge, the bottom line, the technological edge that Iran has really, one DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency analyst told me, is simply remarkable. That their ability to create, not just to provide this, missiles, rockets, drones to allies to help them build them themselves, is the fact that each of these countries, if you drew a circle of 800 kilometers around each one, you'd find that all of these kind of circles overlap. And so Iran doesn't often need to do things itself. It has given its allies the capabilities to do it either on Iran's behalf or because of their own agendas. And so, this technological edge extends way beyond the nuclear issue, and in many ways is the more dangerous component, because these are instruments that Iran has used, will use, or is likely to use in the future. Whereas a nuclear weapon, Iran knows that if it even did a test, it would come under attack, whether it's by Israel, United States, coalition, whatever, that's Iran can do that for a deterrent capability with the fear that it might use it, but the reality is Iran is already using drones, and that's, I think, a scary proposition for not just the Gulf allies but also to the United States. You're on mute.
Thanks, Genevieve.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good one. Iraq, I think, is a very good example of Iran supplying its proxies, the militias, with drones and other military equipment that they can no longer control. So if we just take, I'll sort of work backwards, the recent drone attack on the Prime Minister's residence, the Prime Minister Khademi, this was an assassination attempt, which just occurred a month or so ago, and it has been largely attributed to the Iranian-backed Shia militias. Now, did Iran order this attack? It's highly unlikely. It's much more likely that the militias orchestrated this on their own in response to their defeat in the election. So I think that, it's a simple case if you look at Iraq of, once you arm the proxies, you no longer have control over them. And I think that we have seen less Iranian control over the military activities of the proxies, particularly as it regards attacks on the United States. In the beginning, when after the assassination of the commander Soleimani, who of course was in charge of most of the, was the commander of the Shia militias in Iraq, and that's not putting too much of an emphasis on it. I mean, that's in practice what had happened. There was a lot of disagreement among the Shia militias as to how they were going to respond to the United States, how they were going to respond to the Iraqi government. With the absence of Soleimani's leadership, it became much more diverse and chaotic in terms of their use of Iranian arsenal than it had been in the past. So then you started seeing an increasing number of attacks on United States personnel, United States bases. And the question became, well, if the Iranians want a nuclear deal with the United States, why are they then ordering their proxies in Iraq to attack US targets in Iraq? So it didn't make any sense. And I think that the logical conclusion is that, as I mentioned earlier, these militias are armed with Iranian military capability, but they're not following the orders from Tehran. And we have seen this in a number of cases. Now, there has been some sort of tacit agreement among the militias that they're no longer attacking US personnel in Iraq, what personnel still exists there. We have seen these attacks decline in recent months, but yet they're attacking their Iraqi opponents, particularly people like the Prime Minister, and they're continuing to use violence against the protesters and civil society activists. So I think, again, once Iran has armed their proxies, obviously they have limited control over what they're going to do with this military capability. And that's the great danger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jim, can I just add one thing here? Just one sentence.
Of course.
I had a very wise former US ambassador in the region, senior official, who said to me, we may one day regret not having someone like Soleimani around he was the one force who might have been able to rein in some of these militias if they went too far.
Got it. I would also cite our friend, ex-Foreign Minister Zarif's comment, though, that taking Soleimani out was like taking out a whole division of the IRGC. So I think the jury is still out on that one. But I hear you, Robin, and there were certainly times when the militias in Iraq were attacking us when it was clear they weren't doing it on Iran's orders. As I well know from my time there, they have their own reasons to hate us well beyond what Iran tells them to do. Thanks. Okay, next question. How will non-traditional security threats such as climate change manifest in 2022. Abdullah, you're from the Gulf, where climate is a huge issue, even in the best of times. Why don't you start, but I would invite others to respond to this. So climate change 2022, over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, climate change is a global threat, not just to the region, but globally as well. We are all going to suffer from the changes that are taking place at the moment and in the future. But we have to also understand that the region itself is poor in terms of water endowment. It may be rich in oil and gas, but it doesn't have enough water. And that is already, has been exhausted as well. So you have a water security, and with that goes food security as well. But we are now seeing rise in temperature as well because of the climate change, and that is expecting to increase. That's obviously going to have a huge impact on the maritime life in the region, and some of the islands and the shores of the Gulf. The cities of the Gulf will become almost intolerable in the summer to live in, which means further cooling and further electricity generation and further CO2 emission, which is going to be add to further of course pollution to the environment. It's a vicious circle that is going to be very difficult to confront at a national level. It requires a regional, but even a global collaboration. And we have seen recently, there are some of the climate change already affecting us. The typhoons, for example, or the rains that we have seen in Oman, for example, have caused havoc, killed a lot of people, and almost destroyed villages and roads and cities, especially the ones along the Batna coast in Oman. So, and people until now are still suffering because of that. So, what are we planning for it? I don't know. This is not something that can be just confronted by one country on its own. It's a global issue, as I said earlier, and it requires regional and global collaboration. And I think this is one way of getting the regional countries to work together, is because they are confronting one common threat, as it were, and that is the global security. The change in climate change, and that is something that we need to work on at a regional level. And I believe there are already some workshops and some discussions taking place amongst the regional countries, and also between regional countries and global powers, and of course international United Nations, etc., to start to tackle these issues. But I think the challenges are immense because the region is quite fragile, as it were, as I mentioned earlier, because of the lack of water, food security, and now we are getting all these, whether it is droughts or even rain that we are not we're not capable of handling because our infrastructure has not been built to do so, and also the threat to the maritime and to the islands in the region because of the rising sea, the level of the sea. So I think it is quite a challenge, and it requires a lot of work in that regard.
Thank you. Anybody else want to talk about climate in the region? Robin does. Go ahead, Robin.
This mute unmute stuff is so cumbersome. I would just say that I think Iran faces incredible environmental challenges. And you think that last year it had electricity and water shortages in 300 cities. That's about a quarter of its urban environments, that they saw protests over these shortages. Iran has had existential pollution problems. Tehran is, as Jenny knows well, is just a terrible, terrible mess. They have these huge billboards around the city that will tell people, children, old people, anybody with physical challenges, to stay indoors. And it happens more and more often. It's kind of like Beijing. Several other cities are deeply polluted as well. I've always said that that revolutions fail when they kind of, for these economic and these human reasons, that they don't deliver. It's less about the kind of the belief in an ideology. It's really it's the economics. It's the kind of the basic living, daily existence questions. And on this, Iran has a real problem. And COVID, of course, has accelerated those problems. And it was one of the first epicenters. And in the last week, it said it's facing a 6th round. It came up with its own vaccine. I don't know the efficacy, but because it finally gave up, broke down and brought in some AstraZeneca from Europe. But these are real issues for the Islamic Republic, and especially a young generation, and those civil society activists that, as Jenny knows better than anyone, who have tried very hard, unfortunately keep getting imprisoned or kind of forced into exile or underground. And these all intersect in ways that I think are very telling.
Okay, thank you. What we're going to do is now have final statements. We have a little bit more time if our panelists are willing to stay on for a few minutes more. Please limit your statements to 2 minutes. I'll use my moderator's prerogative to address one point that Abdullah said. I think it's important, and it involves the strike on the Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia by Iran and the impact on that on perceptions of America's security guarantees. I wish either administration, Trump or Biden, had said this publicly. Hope they'd said it privately, but I'm pretty sure they haven't. And that is, there was a misconception behind that. It was clear to us after we didn't respond to the Iranian strike on a $150 million US drone that we were not going to probably respond to a single one-off strike that, of course, Aramco, and I've visited their headquarters, and got the facility up and running very quickly and without casualties. The problem is that the United States sees security from most of the extraordinary threats that everybody face, including violent threats, as a by, with, and through. We don't strike those people who fire rockets at Israel, PKK terrorists who launch attacks inside Turkey, or the Houthi rocket strikes on Saudi Arabia, most recently on the Emiratis. Rather, we do several things. One is we provide various diplomatic, military, and other support to those countries. Secondly, we're a balancer. We're an offshore balancer, even though we have troops on the ground. That is, when something really big happens, when the Soviets were ready to go into Egypt in 1973, when they went into Afghanistan in 1980, and when Saddam gobbled up Kuwait, that's when we say, hey, the region can't deal with that ourselves. That's our first priority, to work by, with, and through them. That's where we're going to act. Now, though that, if you will, smorgasbord of security offers, it's like we're a Walmart and we're selling a set of security products. Those are the security products we're selling. I don't think we ever said that if country X strikes one of your installations, we will go to war with that country. We should have made this clear. What I said, Mike and I know this instinctively because we've dealt with it in concrete cases when we were in the White House, but we are very bad at explaining this to our partners and allies in any coherent way. I don't know, did you ever tell anybody, Mike? I never told anybody that's the deal.
I don't think so, Jim, but my memory is not strong about those conversations. I would So I guess I'll just pick up on what Jim said. I think that that Jim is right about that. I agree with that. I think, though, that in a way you're understating the problem, because it's not just that we didn't do something. It's that, we made statements essentially disavowing an interest in doing something. And I think that this plus, the policy over now years has fed this sense in the region that the United States is withdrawing. It's not physically true. Our troops are still there. Our embassies are still there. Our bases are still there. But it's pervasive in the region, and all of you will know this. So when you go there, there is a sense that the U.S. is in retreat, and that we can't be relied upon. And I think that, the answer is not to simply say, no, we're not going anywhere, because our partners know that that's not the case. They know that we're trying to emphasize great power competition. They know that we're increasingly seeing China as our number one challenge. They certainly watch the news and know what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And so trying to convince them that there's nothing to see here is, I think, the wrong approach. I think what the United States needs to do is to level with partners that, yes, we are not going to have the resources to commit to the region in the future. We're not going to have the same strategy in the future as we did in the past. Some of them will welcome that because some of them didn't like U.S. strategy in the past. But then to sort of talk with them about, number one, how we do see our interests, our enduring interests in the region. Number two, how we see ourselves acting to defend those interests. And number three, what we can do with them to ensure that they're better equipped to advance mutual interests. And again, I go back to the Abraham Accords, which I think is an opening for that, but it's not only the Abraham Accords. U.S. bilateral relationships with most partners in the region, frankly, have taken blows in recent years. And we do need to tend better to those relationships. UAE, Israel, even though those are our two closest partners, but certainly countries like Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. relationship is in a pretty parlous state, I would say. So I think it's better to be honest, to be transparent, to articulate, here's what our strategy is going to look like going forward, than to simply either avoid talking about it or to suggest that it's not changing, which our partners understand not to be true.
Absolutely. Okay. Let me see. Genevieve, your closing comments, please.
Thank you. I'll just be brief. I think that what Arab societies would like to see in terms of U.S. engagement is certainly they welcome less military engagement, but they would like to see the United States remain involved in terms of investment in infrastructure, education, these sorts of things. And they're also, I think there was a lot of optimism because the Biden administration announced initially that it was going to make human rights a priority of the administration. And I think that that's something that Arab societies are still waiting for, because the human rights situation in many of the countries we're talking about is quite desperate and severe. And Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the list goes on. So I think that that's something that Arab society, that would give the United States a lot of credibility within Arab societies, is to deliver on this promise of paying attention to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Robin.
Sorry, I want to be respectful of our time, so I'm not going to add anything more except to say how much I've enjoyed listening and learning from my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Robin. So Abdullah, you have the very last word, as I had my last word before Mike slapped it down a few minutes ago. So over to you, please.
Well, thank you. I just want to say, and echo what you and Micah said, and Robin and Genevieve as well, and just to add that we need more clarity from the United States. I think, at the official level, but also at the public level. At one level, the United States was there to support democracy, human rights, etc., and then you don't see much of that. So what is really the position of the United States in this front? We need to see much more US engagement in the region, not necessarily selling us arms, but economic development, partnership, technology transfer, know-how, etc. And this is where China is winning over the United States in that regard. We need to see much more, open, engaged relationship with the United States. But that's on one level. At the other level, if you like, at the regional level, I think also the Arab countries are to blame as well. We've created our own problems. We haven't been able to, or not just the Arab countries, but the Middle Eastern countries at large. We've created our own problems. We're still living in the old ages of, sectarian, ethnic conflicts, and some of these regimes are thriving on that, and this keeps them in place. So that needs to be changed. The whole idea of a modern state, national state, has to evolve in a way that it is more inclusive and comprehensive and takes care of its own people. And obviously there are going to be, small conflicts there and here that can be sorted out through dialogue and diplomacy, but not through pressures or wars or proxy wars or, developing arsenals and developing nuclear or drone facilities. That is not going to bring peace to the region. What we need to see is a peaceful, prosperous region that can work with everybody, with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Chinese, with the Indians, and the Russians as well, because this region is in the middle of, of the meeting of these continents, and it's in the right place for, the maritime trade, etc., which is the most important. So we need to take advantage of that and be, and work with everybody in a very peaceful way. I know it's wishful thinking, but we need to still wish for a better future for our Middle East. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. That was a great summary to the whole thing. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all of our viewers. Hope to see you all soon again. Out here.